The Civil Rights Act is only about 60 years old. That's not ancient history. My dad is closer to segregation than my kids are closer to the release of the iPhone. But sometimes, the way people talk now, you would think the fight over ownership and access happened hundreds of years ago and disappeared. It didn't. I started really looking deeper into the ownership in America and realized something uncomfortable. Every time Black Americans started building real economic footing, something interrupted it. Sometimes violent, sometimes financial, sometimes political, sometimes through media narratives, sometimes through laws, sometimes through silence, but the pattern keeps repeating. And one of the earliest examples was the Freedman savings bank. Right after slavery ended, Black Americans finally started accumulating money legally at a larger scale for the first time. Formerly enslaved people, Black soldiers, families were trying to stabilize generations of forced labor. Over 60,000 Black depositors eventually put money into the Freedman Bank. For many, this was the first real opportunity to build a savings. And people underestimate what that could have become long term, because savings changes trajectory. Savings becomes land purchases, businesses, education, emergency protection, inheritance, and ownership. Savings creates options, especially in a country where ownership determines stability. But the banks collapsed. Mismanagement, speculation, corruption. And some people even believe the collapse was intentional. A way to redirect or remove growing Black economic power before it could compound into something larger. Now, obviously, nobody can fully prove that part of it. But I understand why people question it. Because historically, whenever Black ownership started gaining momentum in America, there always seems to be a resistance somewhere nearby. And damages from the Freedman's Bank wasn't just financial, it damaged trust. Imagine being one generation removed from slavery, finally trying to participate in an economic system, finally believing your labor could turn into ownership, then watching your savings disappear almost immediately. That changes how generations think about banks, about risk, about ownership, about survival. And honestly, I think some of those emotional patterns still exist today, whether people directly realize it or not. What's interesting, though, is my family responded differently. They held on to property hard. Our house on 31st Street originally started as a boarding house, then my aunt bought it. My family would come from Texas, stay there, get stable, and eventually buy homes themselves. So the property became bigger than a house. It became infrastructure. My grandmother and my grandfather eventually bought property too. Then my dad kept the property, and eventually those houses went into a trust. The goal was never to sell anything fast. The goal was to keep ownership moving forward. Me, my brother, then eventually the generations after us. That mindset matters, because a lot of wealth destruction doesn't happen all at once. Sometimes wealth slowly disappears when assets leave the family, generation after generation. My family viewed ownership emotionally, not just financially. And honestly, I think having a strong Black family structure matters inside this conversation too, because structure creates continuity. My grandmother, my grandfather, my dad, watching them hold on to ownership changed how I thought growing up. I used to look through housing magazines as a kid, wanting to buy a property someday, even before I understood business fully. I think I understood ownership mattered. Then later, music became part of my thinking too. And we started doing music, and I decided to stay independent instead of chasing labels immediately. Even back then, without fully understanding the industry, something about ownership made more sense to me. And over time, I started noticing a pattern too. A lot of Black creativity moves through systems we don't own. Music, news, film, social media, streaming, YouTube, Google, Meta. Most major studios, most streaming platforms, which means a lot of Black stories still move through systems that are controlled somewhere else. And if something doesn't align with those systems, sometimes it gets challenged, suppressed, shadowed, removed, or deprioritized, or simply never amplified in the same way. That matters because media controls visibility. Media controls memory. Media controls what feels important historically. And that's part of why people barely know anything about the Freedman's Bank now. one of the biggest, earliest black financial collapses in American history, and most schools barely spend time on it. But if black Americans had been able to fully protect and compound wealth starting that early, who knows how different ownership could look today? How many businesses would exist? How much more land would exist? How many more media companies would exist? How many more black banks, film studios, record labels, tech companies? That trajectory matters. And honestly, that's part of why I'm building Kayatick Styles. Not because I think I'm magically going to compete with billion-dollar corporations overnight, but because I understand something deeper now. Ownership matters beyond money. Ownership affects memory, visibility, stability, narrative, opportunity. Property gave my family the foundation. Maybe media ownership could be the next layer after that. Because if previous generations fought to hold on to land, then maybe it's my responsibility trying to hold on to the stories, to create media, document history, create our own narrative, highlight positive stories, report our perspectives, and slowly build more ownership in spaces we've historically had less control over. Because if we don't build platforms, eventually somebody else decides what gets remembered about us. And history has already shown what can happen when that happens.